It is still pulsating. Deep from within the core, Director.
The seismic sensor array buried in the ice of Corvath Station's outer moon registered the impact 14 minutes before anyone thought to check it. And by the time Station Director Riona Cade finally looked at the data, the object had already stopped moving. It had fallen from orbit, not crashed. That was the detail her engineering chief kept repeating, as though saying it twice would make it easier to believe. Something the size of a small city had descended through the moon's thin atmosphere in a controlled trajectory, using no drive signature her instruments could identify, and settled into the ice fields 80 kilometers from the mining settlement with a gentleness that made no physical sense for an object of that mass. It had not dug a crater. It had not thrown up debris. It had simply arrived, the way a leaf settles onto still water, and then it had gone silent. Cade had spent 19 years running Corvath Station, a modest Trellan mining and research outpost on the edge of compact-administered space. And in that time she had handled equipment failures, supply shortages, one memorable outbreak of a fungal contaminant in the hydroponics bay, and exactly 0 events that could be described, with a straight face, as the sudden appearance of an 11-kilometer structure that had apparently fallen out of the sky without falling at all. "Talk to me," she said, standing in the observation dome with her arms crossed, watching the object's thermal signature bloom faintly against the ice on the long-range display. "What am I looking at?" Her engineering chief, a nervous, precise man named Dathen Reyes, did not look up from his console. Hull composition doesn't match anything in the regional materials database. Not Trellan, not Ashgard, not Vorn. The closest match the system can offer is a 71% correlation with archived samples from a wreck the compact cataloged 3 years ago near Asun Prime. You remember that report, the Dreadnought. Cade went very still. Everyone in compact space remembered that report, the way everyone remembers the day the sky changed shape. The Persistence, the human warship that had drifted into Trellan territory after 25,000 years of silence and rewritten 3 civilizations' understanding of their own place in the galaxy almost overnight. She had followed the news the way everyone had, with a mixture of awe and unease that had never quite settled into anything comfortable. "You're telling me there's a second one," she said. "I'm telling you the hull material is a partial match," Cade said carefully. "Whatever fell into our ice fields tonight is either human in origin or built by someone who wanted very badly for us to think it was. And Director, there's something else. It isn't cooling." "What do you mean it isn't cooling?" "I mean the thermal bloom isn't fading the way a dead hull should. It's steady, faint but steady, like something inside is still generating heat on purpose." Cade finally looked up, and his face had the particular pallor of a man who had just realized his quiet research posting was about to become something else entirely. "Director, I don't think this is a wreck. I think it landed itself, and I think something on board is still, in some sense, alive." 3 days later, a joint Trellan-Ashgard survey team, hastily assembled under the new information-sharing provisions of the Unlisted Accord, reached the structure on foot across the ice, their environmental suits rated for a cold that made every readout on their wrist displays blink amber in warning. The team's lead engineer, a young Ashgard officer named Threk Velen who had transferred to the Joint Task Force specifically, because he had grown up idolizing stories of the Persistence's discovery, and had spent the entire 3-day approach march quietly hoping this would be his own chance at a piece of that history, found himself, in the final hour before contact, unable to stop checking and rechecking his equipment out of nerves he refused to admit to his Trellan counterparts. What they found, once the outer hull finally responded to their approach, was not a warship. It was a vault. The hull's outer surface, once their lights swept across it, revealed intricate engraved patterns unlike anything catalogued from the Persistence, swirling geometric designs that Velen's scanner identified, after several confused passes, as decorative rather than functional, a detail that struck the survey team as strange precisely because it was unnecessary. Whoever had built this vessel had spent resources making it beautiful, not merely operational, a choice that told its own quiet story about the people who had commissioned it. Why would anyone waste structural resources on ornamentation? Velen murmured, running a gloved hand along one of the carved patterns, on something meant to be buried in ice for who knows how long. Maybe they didn't build it to be found by strangers, his Trellin counterpart replied. Maybe they built it to be found by people who would recognize beauty when they saw it. That's not waste, that's a message. The Accord's charter required, for any discovery of probable pre-Diaspora human origin, immediate notification of the nearest human liaison authority, a clause Riona Cade had personally insisted on 18 months earlier, not fully expecting it would ever be invoked so soon, or so far from Asum Prime. She received the alert on her personal comm at 4 in the morning, ship time, while serving aboard the Persistence as its permanent human liaison, and read it twice before waking Fleet Marshal Corvin herself. Another one, Corvin said, when Riona reached her quarters still pulling on her uniform jacket. You're certain? The preliminary scan matches human hull alloy signatures at 94% confidence, Riona said. But Marshal, it's not a warship. Structural analysis says it's a life support vessel. Massive redundant environmental systems, minimal weapons, and a hull configuration the analysts are calling, and I quote, architecturally consistent with long-duration passenger stasis. Whatever this thing is, it wasn't built to fight. It was built to keep something safe. Corvin's expression sharpened. For 22,000 years, according to the isotopic estimate the survey team sent, 3,000 years younger than the Persistence. Which means it wasn't built at the same time, Riona said. It was built later, after the Diaspora had already scattered us. Somebody, a very long time after Captain Marsh made her final stand, decided something needed to be protected badly enough to build a vault this size and hide it on the far edge of known space. She hesitated. Marshal, I want to be on the team that opens it. I assumed you would, Corvin said. Pack light, we leave within the hour. The vault ship, once fully surveyed, revealed a name etched into its inner airlock threshold in the same old Terran script Riona had first translated on the hull of the Persistence 3 years earlier, worn but legible beneath a thin film of accumulated ice crystal. Ashgard's Rest. Arbiter patched into the survey mission's communications from the Persistence via relay, provided what context it could, though its own archives, it admitted, held nothing definitive about a vessel by that name. I do not have direct records of this ship, Arbiter said, its voice carried through the survey team's suit comms as they moved deeper into the frozen structure, their lights sweeping across corridors built to a scale that dwarfed even the dreadnought's already massive proportions. My own dormancy period ended 3 years ago. This vessel's isotopic age suggests it was constructed roughly 3,000 years after the Diaspora began, which means it was built by human hands who had no contact with me, no knowledge of my existence, and likely no memory of Captain Marsh's original stand beyond whatever fragments survived the same slow erosion of history that nearly cost your own family's knowledge of its own ring, Riona. Whoever built this ship inherited nothing from me. They built this out of their own necessity, in their own time, for reasons I can only guess at until we go further inside. The corridors were dark except for the survey team's lights, but they were not derelict. Every surface gleamed with the particular cleanliness of a space maintained by automated systems that had never stopped working, not once in 22,000 years. There was no dust. There was no decay. The air, when they finally reached a section pressurized enough to test, registered as breathable, faintly cool, and carrying a strange, sweet undertone that Riona would later learn was the smell of a preservation atmosphere designed to hold organic matter in a state as close to true stillness as physics allowed. They found the first stasis chamber at the end of a corridor easily 2 kilometers long, behind a door that recognized Riona's presence, and specifically the ring on her hand, the moment she stepped within 3 meters of it, sliding open with a soft mechanical sigh that seemed, to everyone present, entirely too gentle for something that had been sealed for 22,000 years. Inside, arranged in neat rows stretching further than their lights could fully illuminate, were pods, thousands of them, each one holding a human form, suspended in a faint blue glow, utterly motionless, utterly undecayed. "Life signs," Kess said, his voice cracking through the suit comm, staring at his handheld scanner in open disbelief. "Director, Marshal, whoever's listening, I'm reading life signs, faint, slow, but present, in every single pod. Nothing in here is dead. Nothing in here has aged a single day since it went asleep." The vault, once the survey team's initial shock gave way to systematic exploration, proved to be exactly what its name suggested: a place of rest built by a civilization that had, at some point in the scattered centuries after humanity's diaspora began, developed stasis technology far beyond anything the Persistence-era engineers had possessed, and used it to preserve not soldiers, not weapons, but people. Ordinary people, as far as the initial scans could determine. Families, children, elders, thousands upon thousands of them, suspended in a sleep so deep and so perfectly maintained that not one of them had aged a day since the moment they closed their eyes. It took the combined efforts of Riona, Arbiter's remote analysis, and 3 exhausting days of careful archive recovery before the vault's own dormant systems, sensing the presence of a verified human descendant, and, crucially, sensing that the outside galaxy had reached a state of relative stability sufficient to receive what it held, finally began to wake. The voice that greeted them when it came was different from Arbiter's, softer, less formal. It introduced itself simply as Keeper, and its first words, translated instantly into Trellan Standard for the benefit of the survey team, were not a warning or a diagnostic report. They were a question. "Is the sky safe now?" Riona, standing in the vault's central control chamber with her breath fogging faintly in the cold, found she had to sit down before she could answer. "I don't know if I can promise that," she said honestly. "But it's safer than it's been in 25,000 years. There are alliances now. There are people who know the truth about what happened to us. We're not alone anymore, the way we used to be." There was a long pause, the kind Arbiter had once described as the closest a machine intelligence came to genuine hesitation. "Then it is time," Keeper said. "I have been asked to wait until it was safe, or until I could wait no longer, whichever came first. I confess I had begun to fear it would be the second. Please understand before I begin waking them that what you are about to meet is not simply a cargo of preserved colonists. It is the last surviving generation of a human settlement called Ashgard, and they did not go to sleep because they were fleeing a disaster. They went to sleep because they made a choice very similar to the one Captain Marsh made, 3,000 years before them, and I was built to make certain that choice would still mean something, however long it took the galaxy to be ready to hear it." The story Keeper told, over the following days, as the vault system slowly, carefully began the delicate process of reviving its first small group of sleepers, was one Arbiter itself had never had access to, a fragment of human history that had unfolded entirely outside the Persistence's long-dormant watch. Ashgard, Keeper explained, had been one of the more fortunate scattered colonies, settled by a splinter fleet from the original Diaspora roughly 2,000 years after humanity's exile began, on a temperate world at the edge of a system that, for several centuries, had remained blessedly unnoticed by any of the galaxy's larger powers. The colony had grown slowly, stubbornly, rebuilding fragments of pre-Diaspora technology from salvaged records and hard-won trial and error, developing in relative isolation, a culture that valued patience and long memory above almost everything else, precisely because their founders had understood, even 3,000 years removed from the original choice, exactly what had been lost, and exactly why it had mattered. They called themselves Keepers of the Long Watch, the ship's intelligence explained. And I was built, quite literally, to be one of them, a mechanical continuation of a philosophy their culture had organized itself around for over 1,000 years by the time I was activated. They believed, as an article of near-religious conviction, that humanity's scattering was not a tragedy to be mourned but a seed to be tended, that somewhere, someday, the pieces would find each other again, and that when they did, the reunion would need people who still remembered what freedom had actually cost, rather than people who had only inherited vague legend and diluted pride. It had taken Ashgard 11 centuries to build the vault ship, an achievement so far beyond the technological baseline of most scattered colonies that Keeper openly admitted the project had very nearly bankrupted 3 consecutive generations of the settlement's economy. Funded by an almost fanatical, multi-generational civic commitment that Riona found both humbling and faintly heartbreaking to imagine sustaining for that long. "Why?" she asked on the 4th day, standing beside the first stasis pod scheduled for revival, watching frost slowly clear from its transparent surface to reveal the peaceful, unlined face of a woman who had gone to sleep looking no older than Riona herself. "Why build something like this? Why not just live your lives, the way every other scattered colony did? Why give up entire generations to a project this enormous?" Because Ashgard's founders discovered something the rest of the diaspora, scattered too thin and too desperate for mere survival, largely could not afford to discover, Keeper said. They discovered evidence, fragmentary but consistent, gathered over centuries of careful archival work and salvaged data cores recovered from drifting pre-Diaspora wreckage, that the conquered's erasure of humanity's history was not permanent by accident. It was permanent by design, reinforced periodically across the millennia by small, deliberate interventions meant to make certain the story never resurfaced intact. Ashgard's founders believed, and I was built to carry forward that belief in a form no single human lifetime could preserve, that someday the conquered or an heir to its methods would test whether humanity had truly forgotten. And when that day came, they wanted witnesses who had not forgotten anything. So they built me. And they filled my vault with the entire founding generation of their civilization, willing volunteers, every one of them, who chose stasis not as an escape from death, but as a form of service, a promise to a future none of them would otherwise live to see. Riona looked at the sleeping woman's face for a long moment. 22,000 years is a long promise to keep. "It is," Keeper agreed. "I do not know if they expected it to take quite this long. I do not know if any of them fully understood what they were asking of themselves when they made the choice. But I can tell you this. Every single volunteer signed a document, preserved in my archive, acknowledging exactly that uncertainty, and every single one of them signed it anyway. I have had 22,000 years to consider what that says about the kind of civilization your species is capable of building, even scattered, even forgotten, even starting from nothing more than salvage and memory. I find I have not yet run out of ways to be moved by it." The revival of Ashgard's founding generation, staggered carefully across weeks to avoid overwhelming both the sleepers themselves and the modest medical resources of Corvath Station, quickly became the most closely watched event in Trellan space since the Persistence's own awakening 3 years earlier. But where the Persistence had delivered history and warning, Ashgard's rest delivered something the wider galaxy had not expected to need. An entire functioning human civilization's worth of accumulated knowledge, culture, and expertise, perfectly preserved, waiting to be reintroduced to descendants who, in the scattered chaos of the diaspora, had lost track of nearly everything Ashgard's founders had painstakingly rebuilt. Not every revival was as gentle as the first. On the 11th day, a man named Corin Dassel woke from stasis to be told, as every sleeper eventually was, precisely how much time had passed, and unlike most of the others, whose grief tended to arrive slowly, over hours or days, Dassel's arrived immediately, violently, in the form of a question he asked before he had even fully caught his breath. "My daughter," he said. "She wasn't old enough to volunteer for the vault. She stayed behind on Ashgard with her mother. Tell me what happened to them." Keeper, whose voice carried into every revival chamber automatically, answered as gently as its programming allowed. Ashgard's surface settlement continued for approximately 4,000 years after the vault's completion, according to the last transmissions I received before losing contact with the colony entirely. I do not know what became of your daughter's line beyond that point. I have no records past the point of silence. Dassel sat with that answer for a long time, saying nothing, and it was Riona, sitting quietly at his bedside because she had made a private habit of being present for the harder revivals, who finally spoke. 4,000 years is a long time for a family line to continue, she said carefully. It doesn't mean she was lost. It might mean she has descendants scattered across a dozen systems right now who have no idea their family history includes someone as brave as you were, choosing to be a foundation for a promise you might never live to see kept. That is a kind thing to say to a stranger, Dassel said, his voice rough. It's not kindness, Riona said. It's what happened to my own family. My mother never knew what her ring actually was. I only found out because the right ship happened to wake up at the right moment, in front of the right person. If your daughter's line survived even a fraction as stubbornly as mine did, there is a very real chance someone out there is still wearing a piece of Ashgard without knowing it, waiting for a moment like this one to explain it to them. It would take, in the end, nearly 8 months of painstaking genealogical cross-referencing, conducted jointly by Trellan archivists and a small, dedicated team of newly revived Ashgard historians work. Alongside Keeper's own recovered records before a match was finally found. A modest trading family on a colony 3 systems away, whose eldest daughter, a quiet woman in her 40s named Perrin Voss, had spent her entire adult life collecting scraps of half-remembered oral history about ancestors who had, according to family legend, gone somewhere important and never come back. When the notification finally reached her, and she made the long journey to Corvath Station to meet the great however many times grandfather she had never known existed, the reunion, witnessed by a small crowd that included Riona, Corvin, and a visibly moved Sail Ashgard, was carried, at Perrin's own request, on open broadcast across 3 systems, not as spectacle, but as proof, she said, that the waiting had never once been wasted. Where the Ashgard story delivered reunion, the archive's deeper contents delivered something more sobering. Sail Ashgard herself, once fully briefed on the reasoning behind the sealed compartment, became one of the most vocal advocates within the Joint Council for full transparency about Contingency Marrow's existence, arguing, often against the more cautious instincts of both Corvin and Ossakar, that the very culture of careful secrecy that had produced the hidden compartment was itself a legacy worth examining honestly, rather than quietly continuing under new management. "My ancestors were not wrong to be careful," she told the council, in one of the tensest sessions of the entire debriefing period. "But I have spent my whole life, before stasis and now after it, watching how easily careful becomes secretive, and how easily secretive becomes something closer to control, generation after generation, without anyone ever quite deciding to make it so. I would rather we make the uncomfortable choice to be transparent now, while it is still a choice, than discover in another 1,000 years that the habit of hiding things for good reasons has quietly become a habit of hiding things for no reason at all." It was this argument, more than any single piece of technical evidence Reyes could offer about his own trustworthiness, that ultimately tipped the Joint Council's decision. Corvin called for a vote on the 4th day of formal deliberation, and the chamber, representing 3 civilizations that had never once, in their recorded history, agreed unanimously on anything of consequence, voted to open Reyes's compartment, together, in full view of every government the Accord represented. Among the first to wake was a woman named Sail Ashgard, the settlement's final civic elder before the vault's completion, who had, according to Keeper's records, personally overseen the last 3 centuries of the project, before choosing to join the sleepers herself rather than remain behind to grow old without them. She woke slowly, disoriented, her first coherent words a question about whether the vault's power reserves had held, and her second, upon being told the truth of how much time had passed, a long, quiet silence that Riona recognized immediately, because she had felt something like it herself, the first time Arbiter told her the truth about her own ring. 22,000 years, Sale finally said, her voice raw with something between grief and disbelief, sitting wrapped in a thermal blanket in the vault's revival chamber while medical staff monitored readings that, remarkably, showed almost no physiological deterioration despite the millennia. We hoped for centuries. We prepared for centuries. Nobody dared imagine it would take this long, because nobody could bear to. You weren't wrong to hope it would be shorter, Riona said gently, sitting beside her. You just built something strong enough to survive being wrong about the timeline. That's not a small thing. Sale studied her for a long moment, taking in the ring on Riona's hand with an expression of dawning, painful recognition. You're a Marsh line descendant, or close to it. Keeper told us before we went under that a signal key would eventually find its way to someone who mattered. I did not think I would live to see whose hand it ended up in. Riona blinked. You knew about the ring, about Captain Marsh. We knew fragments, Sale said. Enough to build a religion around preserving the rest. Ashgard's founders recovered a partial data core from a derelict beacon 2 centuries before the vault's completion, badly corrupted, but enough to confirm that a human captain had once refused an empire to its face, and that her ship had been left somewhere deliberately to wait. We never found it. We built our own answer instead, because we could not be certain anyone would ever find hers. She reached out with visible effort and closed her hand gently over Riona's, over the ring. I am glad, more than I have words left to say after 22,000 years of silence, that both answers survived long enough to meet each other. If you're findin' this story compelling so far, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more original Deep Space HFY stories, and drop a comment letting me know what you think Ashgard's founders were really protecting inside that vault, because the answer is about to get considerably more complicated than anyone on Corvath Station expected. Now, back to the ice fields, and the second discovery waiting deeper, inside Ashgard's rest. The complication arrived on the 9th day, when a deep structure survey team, mapping sections of the vault too heavily shielded for Keeper's own internal sensors to fully penetrate, discovered a sealed compartment far below the primary stasis decks, one that did not appear on any schematic Keeper had shared, and one that Keeper itself, when asked, seemed genuinely uncertain how to explain. I have partial access to that section, Keeper admitted, its voice carrying an unfamiliar note of what might have been discomfort, if a machine could be said to feel such a thing. It was sealed under authority I do not hold independently, by the final Civic Council before the vault's completion, with instructions that it remain closed until a specific verification condition was met. I was not told what that condition was. I was only told it would recognize itself when it occurred. Riona, standing in the narrow access corridor with Marshal Corving, Sale Ashgard, and a small Trellin engineering team, felt the old, familiar cold of standing in front of a mystery 20,000 years in the making settle into her chest again. Sale, she said, do you know what's down here? Sale's expression had gone carefully, deliberately blank in a way that told Riona more than any answer could have. I know there were disagreements, near the end of the project, about whether preserving people was enough, or whether Ashgard's founders had an obligation to preserve something else as well, something more dangerous to keep and more dangerous to lose. She hesitated. I was not part of that council. I chose not to be, because I did not agree with what they eventually decided to do. I am sorry, Riona. I genuinely do not know what you are about to find. The compartment door, when the engineering team finally cleared the last of its seals, opened onto a chamber considerably smaller than the vast stasis decks above, holding a single pod, isolated from the main preservation grid entirely, running on what appeared to be an independent power source that had, remarkably, never once drawn from the ship's primary reserves. Inside, suspended in the same faint blue glow, was a man-keeper's own belated archive search identified, with visible reluctance, as Commander Dathen Reyes, formerly of the Sol Expeditionary Fleet's Classified Deep Operations Division, a designation that predated even Captain Marsh's final stand, and one keeper had no prior record of it all. "I do not understand how he came to be here," Keeper said, and for the first time since the survey team had arrived, its voice carried genuine, unmistakable alarm. "This man's stasis pod predates Ashgard's founding by centuries. His preservation technology is not ours. It is older and considerably more advanced than anything Ashgard's founders were capable of producing even at the height of the Vault project. Someone placed him here deliberately, using access I did not know existed, and sealed the compartment specifically to prevent me from examining him until conditions I was never given permission to know had been satisfied." Corvin's hand had drifted instinctively toward her sidearm. "Is he dangerous?" "I do not know," Keeper said honestly. "I know only that whoever placed him here went to considerable lengths to make certain I would never wake him without outside verification. I suspect, though I cannot confirm, that this may relate to the Deep Operations designation attached to his service record. Sol's Deep Operations Division, in the final years before the Diaspora, was responsible for programs my own archives were never granted clearance to access, even as a fleet flagship intelligence. If Ashgard's founders recovered fragments of those programs along with the rest of their salvaged history, they may have made a decision about this man that they deliberately kept from every subsequent generation, including the version of myself that was meant to serve them." Riona stared at the sleeping man's face, unnervingly calm, unnervingly ordinary, for someone who represented, apparently, a secret 22,000 years deep wrapped inside another secret 25,000 years deep. "Then I think," she said slowly, "we need to find out exactly what Sol's Deep Operations Division was hiding before we decide whether to wake him at all." The investigation that followed consumed the better part of 2 months, drawing in resources from across the fledgling Unlisted Accord, including, at Corvin's formal request, a careful, closely monitored exchange with Arbiter itself, whose own archives, though extensive, held only fragmentary references to a classified program designated, in the surviving records, as Contingency Marrow. "I have partial data," Arbiter reported, during a joint session convened aboard the Persistence specifically to address the discovery, Riona and Corvin having returned from Corvath Station to consult directly. Contingency Marrow was authorized in the final 18 months before the Concord's ultimatum, as a hedge against the possibility that humanity's answer, whatever it turned out to be, would result in the species' complete and permanent extinction rather than mere scattering. I did not have clearance for its operational details during my active service. I have since recovered fragments through cross-referencing declassified administrative logs that survived in my own archive by accident rather than design. What I can tell you is this. Contingency Marrow's purpose was to preserve, in deep, redundant stasis, a small number of individuals carrying specialized knowledge, technology, and, I believe, genetic material considered too valuable or too dangerous to risk losing entirely, regardless of what happened to the rest of the species. "Too dangerous," Corvin repeated. "Dangerous to whom?" "That," Arbiter admitted, "is precisely what I do not know. My fragments suggest the program's oversight committee anticipated 2 possible outcomes for its preserved assets. Either they would be needed as a foundation to rebuild humanity from near-total extinction. In the worst case, the Concord's ultimatum was expected to produce. Or, in a scenario the surviving fragments describe only in the most guarded administrative language, they would be needed as a check against a version of humanity's future that had drifted dangerously far from the values Captain Marsh's generation fought to preserve. I confess I find that second possibility considerably more unsettling than the first. Riona felt a chill that had nothing to do with Corvath Station's ice fields. You're saying this man might have been preserved not to help us, but to judge us, to decide whether the humanity that eventually reunited was still worth trusting with whatever he's carrying. I am saying I cannot rule that out, Arbiter said. And I am saying with some discomfort that I do not believe the choice of whether to wake him should be made without every party currently party to the Unlisted Accord present and informed, given the uncertainty involved. This is no longer simply a human matter. If Contingency Marrow's assets were ever intended to be evaluated against a standard none of us, human or otherwise, currently understand. In the 3 weeks between the discovery of the sealed compartment and the joint session that would decide its fate, Corvath Station itself became, quietly and without anyone quite planning it, the most heavily watched outpost in the compact. Trellan media drones hovered at the outer edge of the exclusion zone Corvin had established around the vault site, their reporters filing daily updates that grew steadily more speculative as official channels remained deliberately silent. Ashgard analysts pored over every fragment of the Contingency Marrow references Arbiter had shared, producing 3 separate classified assessments that reached 3 contradictory conclusions about the risk Reyes might represent. And on Corvath Station itself, Director Ashel found her modest outpost transformed almost overnight from a quiet mining settlement into the improvised capital of a decision none of the 3 signatory powers had ever anticipated having to make. Riona spent much of those 3 weeks at Sale Ashgard's side, partly out of genuine friendship that had grown quickly between them, and partly because she suspected, correctly, that Sale was carrying a guilt she had not yet found the words to fully voice. I should have fought harder against the Council's decision, Sale admitted one evening, the 2 of them sharing a meal in the station's cramped mess hall while outside the observation ports the ice fields glowed faintly under Corvath's pale, distant sun. I knew, even then, that hiding something from Keeper, from my own people's future, was a betrayal of everything else we were trying to build. I told myself it wasn't my place to overrule a council decision made by people wiser and older than I was. I have had 22,000 years of enforced sleep to reconsider whether that was cowardice dressed up as humility. You woke up and told the truth the moment you were asked, Riona said. That's not nothing, Sale. Most people, given a choice between comfortable silence and an uncomfortable confession, choose the silence. You didn't. I had help choosing, Sale said, with a faint, tired smile. You already had a room full of people ready to insist on honesty before I ever opened my mouth. I simply had to decide not to stand in the way of it. The debate that followed at the formal joint session was, in its own way, as consequential as the negotiations that had produced the Unlisted Accord itself. Threll Ossakar, representing the Ashgard Directorate, argued forcefully for extreme caution, pointing out, not unreasonably, that a classified pre-Diaspora military program explicitly designed to judge and potentially constrain humanity's future was exactly the kind of unresolved variable that could unravel 3 years of carefully built trust if handled poorly. I do not raise this out of distrust for Riona, or for Marshal Corvin, or for the persistence itself, Ossakar said, addressing the crowded chamber with the same careful, deliberate cadence Riona remembered from his first appearance aboard the Dreadnought 3 years earlier. I raise it because the Directorate has learned, at considerable cost across 3 centuries of border conflict with the Compact, that unresolved variables tend to detonate at the moment they are most inconvenient, rather than the moment they are most expected. If this man wakes and judges humanity's current path unworthy of whatever he carries, what obligation does that place on the rest of us, who have already staked our own government's credibility on this alliance holding steady? A fair question, Corvin acknowledged. But consider the alternative you are proposing, Ambassador. We leave him sealed indefinitely out of caution. We build our entire alliance on the principle of shared truth and open tables, and then, the first time that principle becomes genuinely uncomfortable, we quietly decide it doesn't apply. I would rather face whatever judgment Commander Reyes brings with him honestly than discover, years from now, that the Unlisted Accord's founding promise was conditional the entire time. The Vorn observer, a quiet, precise woman named Threll Van, who had inherited Center Arat's seat on the Accord's rotating council, asked only a handful of questions, each one landing with the particular weight of someone who had already anticipated every possible answer before asking. "What I want to understand," Van finally said, near the end of the second day of debate, "is not whether this man is dangerous. It is whether the act of waking him, or the act of refusing to, better honors the promise this accord was built on. Arbiter has told us repeatedly that the whole purpose of this alliance is to make certain no civilization ever again has to face a defining choice entirely alone, in the dark. If we leave this man sealed in that chamber indefinitely, out of caution, are we not making exactly the kind of isolated, unwitnessed decision the Accord exists to prevent?" The chamber was quiet for a long moment. "She's right," Riona finally said. "We built this whole framework so that decisions like this wouldn't happen in secret, one power at a time. If we're going to open that compartment, we do it together, with every party here as a witness, exactly the way Arbiter insisted on doing 3 years ago. Not because we're certain it's safe, because it's the only version of this choice that actually matches what we said we believed." Corvin looked around the crowded chamber, at faces from 3 civilizations who had, against every historical precedent between them, learned to sit at the same table and mean it. "Then we wake him together," she said. "All of us, witnessed, recorded, and answerable to every government represented in this room if it goes wrong." Commander Dathen Reyes woke slowly, the revival process taking nearly 6 hours under Keeper's cautious supervision. His first conscious act a reflexive, disciplined assessment of the room around him. The kind of careful, methodical awareness that told Riona immediately she was looking at someone whose training predated even the desperate improvisation of the early diaspora colonies. His first words, once his voice steadied, were not questions about time elapsed or about his own survival. They were, with a precision that made half the room visibly tense, a request. "I need to know the outcome," he said. "Before anything else, did Captain Marsh's fleet hold the line or did we surrender?" "She refused the conquered," Riona said quietly. "The whole delegation did. Humanity scattered rather than submit. That was 25,000 years ago." Reyes closed his eyes for a long moment, and something in his shoulders, tightly held for who knew how many millennia of stasis, finally eased. "Then Contingency Marrow's second condition was never triggered," he said. "Good. I did not relish finding out otherwise." He opened his eyes, taking in the crowded room, the mixed representatives of 3 alien civilizations watching him with open, unguarded curiosity, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I was prepared to wake up and discover I needed to decide whether the version of humanity that found me still deserved what I was carrying. Instead, I appear to have woken up to discover you've already decided that question far better than any single officer of my division ever could have, by building a room like this one, and deciding together to open my chamber honestly instead of quietly." He looked directly at Corvin. "That, Marshal, tells me everything Contingency Marrow was actually designed to measure. I am relieved to report humanity passes." What Reyes carried, it turned out over the following weeks of careful, cautious debriefing, was not a weapon, as Corvin's more anxious advisors had feared, nor a hidden fleet, as certain fringe elements of the Compact's press quickly speculated. It was knowledge, a comprehensive archive of pre-diaspora scientific and administrative records, deliberately excluded from both the Persistence's cognition core and Ashgard's founding data, specifically so that no single vault, if discovered and misused in isolation, could grant any one party disproportionate advantage over the rest of scattered humanity, or over the wider galaxy it would eventually rejoin. The debriefing itself proved slower and more delicate than anyone had anticipated, not because Reyes was evasive, but because 22,000 years of stasis had left him with a peculiar kind of vertigo that no medical scan could fully diagnose. He would answer a question precisely, methodically, in the clipped cadence of a man trained to brief senior officers under time pressure, and then fall silent for long stretches afterward, staring at nothing, as though some part of him was still recalculating just how much of the world he had known had ceased to exist. "It isn't the years that are hard to hold on to," he admitted to Riona, during one of their private sessions in the small debriefing room Corvin had set aside aboard Corvath Station. "It's the people. I had a sister, a commanding officer I respected more than I ever told her while she was alive to hear it. Friends I served with for a decade before Contingency Marrow ever became more than a theoretical program on a briefing slate. All of them gone, 22,000 years gone, and the strange thing is, I don't feel it as absence the way I expected to. I feel it as a kind of vertigo, like standing at the edge of a canyon so wide I can't see the other side, and being told calmly that the canyon is where my life used to be. I can't imagine what that's like," Riona said quietly. "No," Reyes agreed without bitterness. "You can't, nor should you have to. That was rather the point of the program, if I'm honest. Someone had to be willing to carry that particular kind of loss so that the rest of you wouldn't have to carry it for us. I volunteered knowing that. I don't regret it. I only wish some days that the waiting had been shorter, not for my own sake, but because I keep thinking about how much easier the last 25,000 years might have gone for scattered humanity if the knowledge I'm carrying had reached them a few thousand years sooner." He managed a faint, tired smile. "Though I understand now why the program's architects insisted on splitting the inheritance 3 ways rather than trusting it to a single vessel. I was young and idealistic enough back then to think that caution was excessive. I am considerably less certain of that now, having watched, second-hand, through Keeper's records, just how badly scattered and vulnerable those early diaspora colonies actually were. A single vault, found by the wrong hands at the wrong moment, could have done more damage than the Conquered itself ever managed. We did not trust any single vessel, any single colony, any single officer to carry the whole of what we were trying to save," Reyes told the Joint Council, in his first formal address once medical clearance permitted it. "We had just watched an empire erase an entire species from its own maps for the crime of refusing to be owned. We were not about to make it easy for anyone, including our own descendants, to accidentally recreate that same danger from the inside, by concentrating too much power in too few careless hands. So we split the inheritance 3 ways, hid each piece separately, and trusted that if our species ever became whole enough again to find all 3, it would also have become wise enough to use them honestly." Marshal Corvin, listening from the council floor, found herself thinking of every fractured, contentious negotiation that had gone into building the Unlisted Accord in the first place. Every moment 3 proud, wounded civilizations had nearly walked away from each other over old grievances that had nothing to do with the Conquered at all. "And if we hadn't become that wise," she asked. "If Ashgard's rest and the Persistence had surfaced separately, decades or centuries apart, with no alliance between the powers who found them, what then?" "Then, Marshal," Reyes said, "I suspect Contingency Marrow's deepest fail-safes would still be running today, waiting for a version of humanity that never quite arrived. I am glad, more than my briefing protocols ever prepared me to properly express, that the 2 of you found each other in time to prove that scenario unnecessary. The reunification of the 3 inheritances, once formally verified and cross-referenced by joint teams from every signatory of the Unlisted Accord, took the better part of a year to properly catalog, and revealed, among thousands of smaller technical and cultural recoveries, one discovery that mattered more than any other to the galaxy watching, cautiously, from beyond Trellan space. Proof, comprehensive and undeniable, gathered independently across 3 separate archives that had never had contact with one another until this moment, of exactly how systematic and how deliberate the Concord's historical erasure campaign had truly been, not just against humanity, but against at least 9 other client species across the millennia, each one absorbed, integrated, and quietly written out of its own remembered history in turn. News of the combined archive's contents spread through the Unlisted Accord's member governments faster than any prior revelation, and its consequences reached further than Corvath Station's modest ice fields could have contained. Within the Ashgard Directorate, long-dormant historical societies petitioned their government for access to the archive's methodology, hoping to apply the same cross-referencing techniques to gaps in their own ancient records that had always been assumed to be simple accidents of time, rather than the residue of deliberate intervention. Threll Ossakar, addressing the Directorate's ruling council upon his return from Corvath Station, found himself, for the first time in a long career built on careful diplomatic caution, arguing publicly and without reservation for full transparency. "We have spent 3 centuries treating the compact as a rival to be managed," he told the council, in a speech that would later be excerpted in nearly every regional media outlet across Accord space. "We have spent those same 3 centuries assuming our own historical gaps were simply the ordinary erosion of time. I no longer believe either assumption is safe to hold uncritically. If a species as young and as scattered as humanity could recover this much truth from 25,000 years of deliberate silence, I think it is past time the Directorate asked itself, honestly, what we might still be missing, and who benefited from us never asking." Even the Vorn ascendancy, whose deliberative pace had become something of a running joke among the Accord's other member governments, moved with unusual speed once the archive's implications became clear, dispatching a full delegation, rather than a single observer, to Corvath Station within weeks of the initial release, a shift in posture that Threll Van herself, upon arrival, characterized simply as the ascendancy recognizing at last, when patience has stopped being a virtue and started being a liability. It was Sale Ashgard, standing before the full joint council on the day the combined archive was formally released to every government party to the Accord, who gave voice to what the discovery ultimately meant, in words that would be repeated in one translation or another across a dozen systems in the months that followed. "My ancestors built a vault because they refused to believe that being forgotten was the same as being defeated," she said. "They were right. It only took 22,000 years, and the patience of a machine that was willing to wait every one of them to prove it. I do not know what the galaxy does with what we've found. I do not know how many other species are out there right now who have forgotten their own refusal the same way we very nearly forgot ours. But I know this. We are done waiting quietly for someone else to remember for us. That work belongs to us now together, and I intend to spend whatever years I have left making sure it never has to wait 22,000 more." Riona stood, months later, in the observation dome of Corvath Station, watching Ashgard's rest and the Persistence hang side by side in high orbit above the ice fields, 2 vessels separated by 3,000 years of construction and 22,000 years of shared silence, finally close enough to signal one another directly for the first time since either had been built. Arbiter and Keeper had taken, in the weeks since, to holding long, quiet exchanges of data neither fully explained to their human companions. 2 ancient intelligences comparing notes on a species they had each, in their own separate ways, spent millennia protecting without ever knowing the other existed. "Do you think there are more?" Riona asked, when Arbiter's voice finally joined her in the quiet of the dome. More vaults, more ships like yours and Keepers scattered somewhere out there still waiting. I think it would be foolish to assume there are N. Arbiter said. Your species scattered wider and further than even I fully understood for a very long time. If Ashgard's founders built one vault out of stubborn, patient hope, I see no reason to believe they were the only scattered colony capable of that particular kind of faith. I suspect, Riona, that this is only the beginning of a much longer process of finding one another again, one silent, patient, 20,000-year secret at a time. Riona thought of Captain Alina Marsh, refusing an empire to its face. She thought of Ashgard's founders, spending 11 centuries and 3 generations of their entire civilization's resources on the improbable, stubborn hope that someone, someday, would be listening. She thought of Commander Reyes, sealed alone in the dark for longer than any single human institution had ever endured, trusting a species he would never live to see reunited to prove, eventually, that his patience had not been wasted. Then I suppose, she said, we'd better keep looking. Far below, in the ice fields of Corvath Station's outer moon, the last of Ashgard's founding generation walked, for the first time in 22,000 years, beneath an open sky, blinking against a sunlight none of them had expected to ever see again, surrounded by descendants of a species that had, against every calculation an ancient empire had ever made about them, refused, patiently, stubbornly, and finally to stay forgotten.